For a lot of us, the Game Boy Advance SP is one of the best handhelds ever made. It was responsible for more than half of all of the Game Boy Advance sales, and it was instantly recognizable thanks to its unique design. Anbernic is hoping that the new RG35XX SP can capture some of its magic. And crazy name aside, I think they actually did a pretty good job. But as we all know, looks aren't the only thing that matters, so let's take a look at what the new SP has to offer and see if it's the right fit for you. Full disclosure, Anbernic sent this unit in for a review, but they haven't seen this video before it released and no money was exchanged. That being said, the 35XX SP retails for $64.99 USD on their official store. It runs on Linux and comes in 4 colors: transparent black, transparent blue, silver, and gray. Just like the other devices in the XX line, it's using the same all-winner H700 chip, so performance is going to be the same. It has a 3.5-inch 640 by 480 IPS screen, 1 mono speaker, and a 3300 mAh battery rated for 8 hours, but more on that here in a second. It doesn't have any internal storage, but it does come with a preloaded 64GB SD card and the option to add a second 128GB card with official support up to 512GB. For I/O, it has 1 headphone jack, 2 microSD card slots, 1 DC OTG port, and 1 mini HDMI port. For connectivity, it has Wi-Fi 2.4 and 5G as well as Bluetooth 4.2, but it's only for controllers, so no audio support. Like I mentioned, the battery is rated for 8 hours, but it depends on what you're playing. With N64, after 4 hours at full brightness, I was just under 50% battery. With Game Boy Advance, after 4 hours, I only lost 30%. And when closing it and leaving it in sleep mode with GBA running after 6 hours, I lost 22% battery. So you should be seeing between 7 and 10 hours of battery life depending on what games you're playing. I have to say, Anbernic did a great job in terms of how this looks and how the materials feel. I wouldn't call it premium, but it's definitely not a cheap feeling device, especially for the price. The plastic has a nice texture to it, it's not gritty, but it's also not smooth. The hinge is always a concern on any handheld, but I don't see anything that would immediately raise any red flags. Anbernic's using basically the same design as the GBA SP, and the plastic feels solid, so I don't think this is going to be an issue. It's definitely something I would feel comfortable just throwing in my pocket or a backpack. But keep in mind, it's still early on and we won't really know if any issues pop up until more people start getting their hands on it. On the back, we have easy access to the battery, which is nice in case we ever need to swap it out. My only concern was that the battery is right on top of the CPU, and at first I thought it was being used as a heatsink, but it doesn't look like it's actually making contact, so I don't think this is going to be an issue since the device doesn't really get hot. You really only notice it when pushing it with N64 or PSP, but even then it's just a little bit warm and not something that ever really bothered me. It would have been nice to see some type of shielding or a heatsink, but it should be fine. The buttons and the D-pad are the only areas where I feel the hardware could have been better. It's not that they're bad, it's just that they're very clicky and a little bit stiffer than what I would have liked. The original Game Boy Advance SP had clicky buttons, but they're quieter and easier to press than what's on this. Let me do a little comparison here with the original SP, the Vita, and a Switch Joy-Con. The D-pad is just as clicky as the buttons, and unfortunately the stiffness is a little bit more noticeable on it. As far as D-pad goes, it's okay, but it has some issues. The biggest problem in my opinion is that the rubber membrane underneath is too thick, and because of that it doesn't have any pivot. If you press down on it, you can activate all 4 dome switches at once. You can still hit special moves in fighting games and hit diagonals in games that need them, but you have to be more deliberate in those movements. Trying to roll the D-pad without a pivot is just not ideal in my opinion. Basically, it's okay, but could have been better, and I think this can be fixed with some new rubber pads, or maybe even trimming down the ones that are already in it. Moving on, menus Start and Select have a hard click to them, the volume rocker feels similar to the face buttons, and the shoulder buttons have a softer feel to them but are just as loud. This brings me to the ergonomics. L1 and R1 sit perfectly underneath your index fingers and feel very easy to use. L2 and R2 feel a little bit awkward, but I don't think they're going to be getting a lot of use anyway. Because it's a little bit wider than most vertical handhelds, it feels great in the hands, and I don't think long PlayStations are going to be an issue on it. While the loud buttons aren't exactly a deal breaker, it does make it something I won't be playing in bed at night, and that's unfortunate because despite what it might look like, I really like this handheld. Overall, it's a comfortable device that looks great and feels solid. While the buttons aren't for me, I know for a lot of people the clickiness is going to be a positive. The screen looks good. Like I said earlier, it's a 640 by 480 IPS panel. It has a good amount of brightness and viewing angles, so you won't have any issues playing outdoors. I'm pretty sure this is the same screen we've seen in the other XX devices, so if you're familiar with those, you know exactly what to expect. On the top part, there's two magnets that help put the device to sleep when you close it, and if you wanted to, you could also take the back part off and put a sticker in there if you want to add some personal flair. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as just taking it off. You do have to remove 5 screws, but it's not too difficult to do, and I'm pretty sure we're going to start seeing custom stickers for this pretty soon. As far as audio, we get a single mono speaker that's functional and decently loud, but nothing special. I'm going to do a quick speaker test for you at max volume, so make sure you adjust your volume accordingly. It's not bad, but it's also not great. It's, like I said, functional. Luckily, we get a headphone jack, and I didn't find any issues with it, so if audio is important for you, probably the best way to go. Now that we've covered all of that, let's do a size comparison. And for this section, I'm going to be comparing the SP in both open and closed positions. First up, the Palkia V90, the Game Boy Advance SP, Miyoo Mini Plus, RG35XX Plus, and the Retroid Pocket Flip. While it is pretty compact when closed up, it's also thicker than a lot of other pocket-friendly handhelds, so keep that in mind. Personally, I think this is a little bit better thrown in a backpack, but you can easily get away with just putting this in your pocket. So that's going to wrap it up for the hardware section. I like most of what's here, even though the buttons aren't my favorite. I think Anbernic did a pretty solid job. Now let's get into the software. The OS is the same as what we've seen in the other XX devices with some minor changes, so let's take a look. We have 7 options on the main screen: Game Room, RA Game, Favorites, History, Search, App Center, and Settings. The first 2 are where we find all of our games. For the most part, I avoid using all of the emulators in the Game Room section other than PPSSPP, since it's the only one that's actually better than what RetroArch has to offer. The others have some basic features like save states and a few shaders and options for aspect ratios, but the emulation just isn't very good and you can see clear pacing issues. RA Game is essentially just a front end for RetroArch, and this is what I would recommend everybody uses. In my opinion, the best thing about RetroArch, besides the customizations you can do, is that you have hotkeys set up for things like fast forward, FPS display, and save states. You can use these by holding down the menu button plus whatever key is mapped to the function you want. The only system in this section that uses a standalone emulator is DS, which is running on Drastic. I'm not sure why Anbernic hasn't moved this yet, but it's not a big deal, just keep in mind that your hotkeys won't work the same. Another benefit of RA games is that a lot of systems are pre-configured with overlays. On GBA, I think it looked pretty cool, but you can turn them off in the App Center. One thing that bugs me is that some options like overwrites, shaders, and retro achievements are disabled. Luckily, it's a pretty simple fix. For the first 2, you can just enable them by going into Settings, RetroArch, User Interface, and Quick Menu Visibility. For achievements, just go to Settings instead of Quick Menu. I don't understand why these are disabled, and I can see how this would be frustrating for people that aren't very familiar with RetroArch. Moving on to the App Center, we have some cool features that add extra functionality like a music player, and what's nice about it is that you can actually close the screen and it'll keep playing your music. But you'll have to open it back up to change the songs since you can't use the shoulder buttons for that. It would have been cool if it could be mapped to that function, but I guess we'll have to wait for a future update, see if Anbernic ever does that. There's also a video player that I wasn't too crazy about at first, but for some reason it feels kind of right to watch old shows on this. If the original SP was good enough for Shrek, who am I to say that this isn't good enough for Cowboy Bebop? There's also an e-reader, but I don't think anybody wants to read a book on a 3.5-inch screen. Next up, we have more apps in the App Center. Originally, these were in the RA game section, but after 5 devices, Anbernic finally moved them. Most of these are things I don't think people will really use, but there's a few good ones in here like night mode in case your screen is too bright when you're playing at night, a quick shutdown function that lets you quickly turn off the device and boot right back into the game. And this one's pretty useful because there's no real sleep mode, so if you know you're going to set the game down for a while, this is a great way to conserve battery. You can also turn off bezels, reset apps, and turn off the LEDs from here. And finally, for the App Center, there's two file managing apps. The one called File Manager gives you access to everything on the SD card, and the other is called Expert. This one just gives you access to your media files, but it doesn't seem like you can do anything from it. The last thing I want to cover here is settings, since the favorites, search, and history tab are pretty self-explanatory. From here you can access the system settings, and here you can change things like background icons, button noises, open RetroArch, set a time and day, connect to Wi-Fi, and even test your inputs. It's nice to see Anbernic continuing to put work into the OS instead of letting the community devs do all the work. As of now, my biggest issue with the stock OS is how long it takes to power on and open and close things. It's not excessive, but it definitely needs to be faster. I think we're getting to a point where stock is good enough for the average user, but I wish it would take a little longer between devices to iron things out so that we don't have to go around looking for updates or custom firmware. That doesn't mean I don't appreciate what custom firmware has to offer, but I want it to be an option, not a necessity. Speaking of that, I know there's a few options in development, but as of now, I think they're all in alpha, so I won't be covering them yet. Having a mini HDMI port is great because it gives you the flexibility of having a tiny handheld that you can carry around in your pocket, but still be able to play those same games on a big TV, but unfortunately, it's not something I would consider ready. Connecting a Bluetooth controller is easy enough and it seems to map correctly according to the I/O tester, but once you get into RetroArch, the games don't recognize it until you go into settings and switch the controller index over to the Bluetooth controller. Once you do that, it's going to work and you're even going to have hotkeys, but they're going to be mapped a little bit different. Usually for something like fast forward, you would hold menu and R2, but with a controller, it gets switched over to select and L3. And when you're done playing, you want to make sure you go back into settings and switch the index back onto the built-in controls, or they're not going to work. Having to do things like that isn't a huge deal, but it is something to keep in mind. The biggest problem in my opinion is that the games are stretched to your screen. You can adjust it a little by changing the aspect ratio from core provided to 1:1, but that doesn't play well with Game Boy Advanced, and once you're done playing, you have to go back and undo all of that. It's a cool idea, but just like with the rest of the XX devices, it's not ready. However, playing on a big screen isn't really the point of a handheld, so let's talk about what it's like to actually play games on the 35XX SP. The H700 is powerful enough to play games up to N64, Dreamcast, and PSP. While those systems aren't the selling point of this device, it's still cool to see how good devices in this price range have gotten. For N64, the D-pad is mapped to work as an analog stick, and pressing R2 makes the face buttons act like the C buttons, so you'll have enough inputs to make things playable. It's not going to be a perfect experience, but having something in this form factor that can play some N64 classics is pretty cool. Dreamcast performance is okay, there's some frame skipping going on, but if you really need to boot up some Sonic Adventures 2 or Star Wars Pod Racers, I think it's fine. A lot of games use the D-pad for movement, but for the ones that need an analog stick, you can just tap the power button and the D-pad will register as a stick. PSP runs fine, but playing 16:9 games on a small 4:3 screen can be an issue for some people. If the small text size doesn't bother you, then this can be a good way to play some RPGs or some PS minis if you just need something for a quick play session. And just like with Dreamcast, you can toggle the D-pad with the power button. These three systems are a bonus, so don't expect every game to work, and you're most likely going to have to go in and mess with settings to get things working right. But it is kind of awesome seeing some of these games running on this hardware. Now, as cool as having those systems is, the best thing to play on this handheld is obviously Game Boy Advance. The games look and run great, and even though the screen isn't the correct aspect ratio, I think the shape makes up for it not being pixel perfect. But of course, it can do a lot more than just GBA. Everything from Game Boy to Neo Geo and PS1 is going to work great, outside of some edge cases like Ape Escape, and thanks to the 4:3 screen, those 8, 16, and 32-bit systems is where this is really going to shine. And personally, on a device this size, I would rather have this screen than a 3x2, since more systems can take advantage of it. Thanks to the power in this device, we can also take advantage of some shaders to really give it more of that authentic feel. For things like Super Nintendo, I've been using one called Fake CRT Geom since I'm not a big fan of the pre-configured bezels and I like how it looks. Even DS games work reasonably well as long as you stick to the ones that don't need a lot of touch input or have patches like Phantom Hourglass. If nothing else, it's awesome having every single Pokemon game from Red and Blue all the way to Black and White 2 on something that looks like this. As a kid, I never got to own a Game Boy Advance SP. I was always a late adopter, and when the chance to get a new gaming device came up, I went with the GameCube. But I always wanted one because it looked so cool. But now I've had one for a while, and I absolutely love it. So when images of the 35XX SP leaked, I got really excited. Is it perfect? No, but I think this is currently the best device in this form factor and one of the best Anbernic's made so far. For me personally, it misses the mark on a few things, but that's just because I don't like clicky buttons. But even that's not going to keep me from using it. If you compare this to the cost of a modded GBA or even unmodded with a flash card, it just makes more sense to get this. And I know it's not original hardware, but let's be honest, software emulation is at a point where for most people, they wouldn't really be able to tell the difference. Well, that's going to wrap it up. I have a feeling this one's going to be a community favorite for a while, and if you want to pick one up, please check out the links in the description. It adds no extra cost to you, and it really helps support the channel. Thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If I missed something or you have anything you want to say, please leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. It really helps more than you know. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.